Conference room on the 14th floor of Hargrove and Associates smelled like leather and old money. I remember thinking that, standing in the doorway in my scrubs, I hadn't even had time to go home and change. My brother had texted me at 6:47 that morning. Reading is at 9. Don't be late. Like I was the one who was always late. I wasn't. I had been awake since 4:30 anyway. Old habit. When you spend 3 years getting up in the middle of the night to check on someone, your body stops knowing how to sleep past sunrise. My brother Derek was already seated when I walked in, suit pressed, hair combed back, the kind of look he only put on when he needed something. His wife Gwen sat beside him with her hands folded on the table like she was in a board meeting. She gave me a small smile when I walked in, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. I'd gotten a lot of those smiles over the years. My older sister Paula was on Derek's other side. She was on her phone. She didn't look up. I sat down across from them and put my bag on the floor. Nobody said good morning. The lawyer, Mr. Backline, Ashford, gray-haired, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, came in a few minutes later and set a thick manila folder on the table. He introduced himself, said the usual things about what we were here for, and opened the folder. That's when I noticed Derek straighten up in his chair. I want to tell this story the right way, because I've told it wrong a few times, leaving out the parts that make me sound weak, or adding too much detail to the parts where I come out looking good. But the truth is more tangled than that. And my father deserves the true version. My father's name was Raymond Elliott Marsh. He grew up in Dayton, Ohio, the second of 4 kids, and he never talked about money except to say he didn't want to think about it the way his own father had. His father, my grandfather, had been an accountant who tracked every dollar the family spent in a leather ledger he kept in the kitchen drawer. My dad said it made dinner time feel like a quarterly review, so my father went the other direction. He became a contractor, built things with his hands. He was good at it, genuinely good. And over 30 years, he built a company that did commercial construction across 3 states. He wasn't flashy about it. He drove a Ford F-150 until it had 240,000 miles on it. He wore the same brand of work boots for 20 years. He took one real vacation that I can remember, a week in the Smoky Mountains, when I was 12, and he spent 2 of those days on the phone with his site foreman. He and my mother divorced when I was 9. Derek was 14, Paula was 16. They both went to live with my mother in Columbus. I stayed with my dad. I didn't make that choice because I was brave or because I understood anything about what it meant. I stayed because my dad cried the night my mother left. Not in front of me, but I heard him through the wall, and I was 9 years old and I didn't know how to leave someone who was crying. So I stayed. And then I just never went. Derek and Paula visited on holidays for a few years and then less, and then mostly they didn't. They called my dad on his birthday and at Christmas. He always sounded happy to hear from them. He always told them he was proud of them. Paula got a law degree. Derek went into finance. My dad talked about both of those things to anyone who would listen. I went to Columbus State for nursing school and came back to Dayton when I graduated. I got a job at Miami Valley Hospital, which was 20 minutes from my dad's house. I told myself it was because the job was good, which it was, but it was also because my dad had started to slow down in ways I didn't have a name for yet, and I wanted to be close. He was 64 when I moved back. He was still running the company, still going to job sites, still the kind of man who showed up before anyone else and left after everyone else. But I started to notice things. He forgot words sometimes. Not often, just occasionally. A specific noun would slip away and he'd circle around it, get frustrated, move on. He lost his keys more than he used to. He told me the same story about a job in Lexington twice in 1 week. I made an appointment with his doctor without telling him. Then I told him, and there was a long silence on the phone, and then he said, "I hate doctors." "I know," I said. "I am one. Kind of." He laughed. He went to the appointment. The diagnosis came back as early-stage vascular dementia, not Alzheimer's. His doctor, a quiet neurologist named Dr. Okafor, explained that it was related to small vessel disease, reduced blood flow affecting cognition. It could progress slowly or quickly. There were things that could help and things that couldn't be changed. My dad sat in that office and listened with the same expression he used on job sites when someone told him there was a problem he hadn't anticipated. taking it in, not panicking, figuring out what to do next. On the drive home, he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "You're not going to make this weird, are you?" "No," I said. "Good." He looked at the window. "I hate when people make things weird." I didn't make it weird. I moved in with him 8 months later, when the progression started to pick up. I kept my job at the hospital, night shifts mostly, so I could be home during the day. I converted the spare bedroom into a proper setup, got handrails installed in the bathroom and on the porch steps, learned the specific texture of his good days versus his hard ones. I cooked. I drove him to appointments. I sat with him when the evenings got confusing, which they did more and more often toward the end. Derek called once a month or so, Paula maybe every 6 weeks. They asked how he was doing, and I told them. They said things like, "Let us know if you need anything, and we really should come visit soon." They didn't visit, not once in the last 2 years. I want to be fair about this. They had their lives. Derek had 2 kids in middle school and a job that took him to New York every other week. Paula had made partner at her firm and was working 70 hours a week. These are real things. I don't think they're bad people. I think it's easy to stay away when someone else is handling it. And I think they told themselves the story that I was fine, that Dad was fine, that nothing was that urgent yet. But I want to be honest about what it was like on my end. It was not fine. Not because caring for my dad was bad. It wasn't. Not in the way people mean when they say something is bad. Some of those years were the best of my life. We talked more than we ever had. He told me things about his own father, about starting the company, about the early years with my mother that I'd never known. There was a tenderness between us that hadn't been there when I was a kid, and he was always at a job site. I am grateful for that time in a way I don't have adequate words for. But I was also exhausted in a way that settled into my bones and didn't leave. I called in sick to work twice in 3 years, and both times I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling because I didn't actually know how to rest anymore. I ate dinners standing up at the kitchen counter. I stopped calling my friends because I never had anything to talk about except how he was doing, and eventually that felt like too much to put on people. When Derek called during those years, he'd ask how Dad was doing, and then he'd say things like, "You're so good at this, though. You've always been the caretaker type." And I never knew what to say to that. It's the kind of thing that sounds like a compliment but isn't, quite. Like saying someone is built for hard things is a reason they should be the only one doing the hard thing. My dad passed away in February. He was 69. He died on a Tuesday morning in his own bed, with me sitting next to him. It was quiet. It was, all things considered, as peaceful as these things can be. I had held his hand and talked to him about the Smoky Mountains trip, about a whitewater rafting moment he had always laughed about. And I don't know how much he heard at the end, but I believe he knew I was there. Derek and Paula flew in for the funeral. They both cried. They were genuine in their grief. I do believe that. My dad was their father too, and they loved him, just from a distance, in the way people love things they can't quite bring themselves to get close to. After the service, standing outside the funeral home, Derek put his arm around my shoulders and said, "You did a really good thing for him, Sarah." My name isn't Sarah. That's not actually what he said. He used my real name, but the feeling was the same, like being thanked by someone who doesn't quite see you. Like being appreciated the way you appreciate a service, a function. I nodded and said thank you. And I looked at the parking lot and I thought, I am so tired. The appointment with Mr. Bainan, Ashford, had been set for 2 weeks after the funeral, just enough time to get through the immediate things, the death certificates, the notifications, the paperwork that nobody tells you about in advance. My dad's office manager, a woman named Connie who had worked for him for 19 years, helped me with most of it. She cried every time I saw her. It made me feel strangely calm, being around someone else's grief. I think I was managing mine rather than feeling it. The morning of the reading, I woke up at 4:30, same as always, and lay in bed in the house that was now mine to do something with, and thought about nothing in particular. I made coffee. I ate half a piece of toast. I drove to the hospital, did 4 hours of a shift I'd already arranged to cover, and then got in my car and drove downtown. I had no idea what to expect. My dad had never talked to me about his will. He'd mentioned once, years ago, that he'd updated it after the divorce, and that was all I knew. I had not thought much about it because I was not, in the practical day-to-day reality of my life, thinking about inheritance. I was thinking about whether he'd eaten enough, whether he'd slept, whether his blood pressure numbers were in the right range. The money was his. I never thought of it as having anything to do with me. Derek clearly had different expectations. I picked that up the moment I walked in. It wasn't one thing. It was the way he was sitting, the specific way Gwen had arranged her legal pad in front of her, the fact that Paula had apparently emailed Mr. Ashford's office twice in the 2 weeks before the appointment asking about the general scope of the estate. Mr. Teen's deaths. Ashford mentioned that last part when he was getting settled, and he said it neutrally, just as a matter of record, and I watched Derek's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Mr. Ashford put on his reading glasses. He began with what he called the standard overview, the structure of the estate, the assets involved. My father's company, Marsh Construction, had been appraised the previous year at approximately $4.2 million. There was also the house, which I had been living in for the past 2 years, a paid-off commercial property in Dayton that the company used as its main office, and personal assets including retirement accounts and savings that Mr. Dold Ashford summarized as substantial. I remember Gwen writing something on her legal pad. Then Mr. Ashford turned a page. He said that my father had been specific and thorough in his instructions, and that the document had been updated as recently as 14 months ago, which he said with a slight emphasis I didn't understand at the time. He read the first directive: the commercial property, valued at approximately $800,000, was to be divided equally between Derek and Paula. Derek nodded. Paula put her phone face down on the table. The second directive, my father's personal assets, the retirement accounts and savings, were to be divided equally between Derek and Paula, with one exception: a sum of $40,000 set aside for a scholarship fund in his name at Columbus State, where he had taken a few night classes in accounting years before I was born, apparently trying to be more like his father and deciding he didn't want to after all. Gwen wrote something else down. The third directive was the company. Mr. Ashford paused here. I don't know if he meant to. Maybe it was just the way he turned the page. But there was a half-second of silence that felt longer than it was. And then he said that Marsh Construction in its entirety was bequeathed to me. The room was quiet. Derek said, "I'm sorry." Mr. Ashford read it again. He also noted that the house was included in this directive. It had been considered part of the company's operational assets since I had been living there in what the document described as a caretaking capacity integral to the continuation of daily operations. My father's language, Mr. Burke, Ashford said. He had written that section himself and asked that it be kept verbatim. Paula had picked her phone back up, but she wasn't looking at it, she was looking at me. I didn't know what my face was doing. I know my hands were flat on the table, very still, because I remember thinking I needed to keep them still. Derek said, there has to be more to this. Mr. Ashford said that there was, in fact, one more element. He reached back into the folder and produced an envelope, a regular white envelope, sealed with my name on it in my father's handwriting. He slid it across the table to me. I looked at it. Is that? Derek started. It's addressed to your sister, Mr. Ashford said calmly. I was asked to deliver it at this meeting. I didn't open it there. I couldn't. I put it in my bag and I sat through the rest of the meeting, which became less of a reading and more of a negotiation attempt. Derek had a lot of questions, most of which Mr. Berzema Ashford answered by referring back to the document. Paula was quiet in a way that felt more considered than Derek's noise. She was a lawyer, after all, and she was listening differently than he was. At one point, Derek said, she was living there rent-free for 2 years. Mr. Ashford said, that is addressed in the document. At another point, Gwen said, it just seems like an unusual structure. And I looked at her and I didn't say anything, and she looked back at her legal pad. I drove home. I sat in my father's kitchen, my kitchen, I supposed, though it didn't feel like it yet. And I made a cup of coffee I didn't drink, and I put the envelope on the table in front of me, and I sat with it for a while. Then I opened it. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten on the yellow legal pad paper he always used. His handwriting in the early pages was the way I remembered it from before. cramped and slanted. The particular script of a man who learned to write before computers and never updated the habit. By the fourth page, it was a little looser, a little less controlled. He had written this over a period of time, I could tell. Different pens, slightly different pressure. He started by apologizing for not telling me any of this in person. He said he had tried to start the conversation 3 or 4 times and kept not finishing it, and that this was a character flaw he was aware of and sorry about. He said he had never been good at talking about feelings in real time, that he preferred to think things through and write them down, and that this was probably why my mother had described him once, with some accuracy, as emotionally unavailable. He told me about the decision to update his will 14 months earlier. He said he had spent a long time thinking about what was fair, that he didn't use the word fair lightly, that he understood what it meant, and that he had come to believe fairness wasn't the same thing as equality. He wrote, "Equal would have been simple. Fair was harder to figure out. I hope I got it right." He talked about Derek and Paula. He wasn't unkind about them. That wasn't who he was. He said he knew they loved him and he loved them. He said he understood the choices they made and held no bitterness. But he also wrote, plainly and without drama, that he was aware of what the last few years had looked like. He knew how much I had given up. He knew because he had been there, watching, and because even on his worst days, even when names escaped him and time blurred at the edges, he had always known who was in the room with him. He wrote, "You were always in the room." Then he wrote about the company. He said he had not left me Marsh Construction as a reward. He was careful to say that this is not a reward because he didn't want me to feel like he was paying me back for something. He said that wasn't the relationship he wanted us to have. He left me the company because he believed I was the only one of his children who would actually run it, who would care about what happened to the people who worked there, who would understand what 30 years of work was supposed to mean. He said he'd seen me manage the night shifts at the hospital, organize the home health aides, negotiate with insurance companies, advocate for him in doctors' offices in a way that made doctors actually listen. He said, "You think you've been a caretaker. You have also been a manager. You have also been an advocate. You have also been, whether you knew it or not, learning how to run something." He said Connie would help. He said she already knew. He had talked to her, he wrote, because he trusted her and because she had agreed to stay on and help through the transition. The last paragraph was short. He wrote, "I was not always easy. I know that. The work boots, the job sites, the phone calls at dinner. I know what I missed and I'm sorry for it, but I am proud of you in a way I should have said out loud more often, and I need you to know that this is not about money. This is me telling you, the only way I knew how, that I saw you. I always saw you. I hope this is the start of something good." He signed it the way he signed everything. His first name, a period, nothing else. Raymond. I sat in that kitchen for a long time. I thought about the Smoky Mountains. I thought about the night my mother left, and the sound through the wall and the choice a 9-year-old makes without knowing it's a choice. I thought about 4:30 in the morning and hospital scrubs and standing at a counter eating dinner alone. I thought about Derek's arm around my shoulders outside the funeral home and the way being thanked can feel like being dismissed. I thought about my father's handwriting on the fourth page, the way it got looser, and what it must have cost him to keep writing when the words were getting harder to hold. Derek called that evening. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message that started with, "Look, I just want to talk through this rationally," and I listened to it once and then set my phone face down on the counter. Paula texted 2 days later. Hers was different, shorter, and something in it felt more honest. She wrote, "I know I wasn't there. I don't know how to explain that except that I think I was scared and I made bad choices. I'm not contesting anything. I just wanted to say I'm sorry." I saved that message. I haven't fully decided what to do with it yet. I think there's a conversation there that we'll eventually have when I'm ready, when the grief has settled into something I can actually sit across from. I called Connie the next morning. We met for coffee at the diner near the office that my dad had apparently eaten breakfast at every Friday for 15 years. I hadn't known that. She told me about it the way she told me a lot of things that week, like she'd been waiting to tell someone, like the stories had been building up with nowhere to go. She told me my dad had come to her about 14 months ago, same time as the will update, and asked her to start briefing him on the business side of things more formally. Not job sites, but finances, contracts, employee records, long-term client relationships. He had spent an afternoon explaining the company structure to me, she said, though she called it something else. She said he had talked through everything, which was his way of teaching without calling it teaching. He used to talk about you, she said, wrapping both hands around her coffee mug, especially toward the end. He'd get going about some problem at a job site, and then he'd say, "My daughter would have figured this out in 20 minutes. He said that a lot. I didn't cry in front of her. I cried in my car in the diner parking lot for about 4 minutes, and then I drove back to the house that was mine now. That was 7 months ago. I am still a nurse for now. I cut back to part-time while I've been learning the business, and Dr. Tam O'Coffer, my dad's neurologist, who it turns out also has a brother-in-law in commercial construction, connected me with a business consultant who specializes in family business transitions. I didn't know that was a whole specialty. There's a lot I didn't know. Connie is still there. She emails me things I don't understand yet, and I ask questions, and she answers them without making me feel stupid, which is its own kind of skill and one I try to remember to tell her I appreciate. The company has 14 full-time employees and a roster of about 30 subcontractors across the region. There's a school renovation project in Kettering currently under contract that my dad had been excited about. I found 3 notes about it in his office, in that cramped, slanted handwriting. I have been to the job site twice. The site foreman, a man named Al who has worked for Marsh Construction for 11 years, shook my hand the first time and said, "Your dad talked about you a lot." I told him I'd been hearing that. He grinned. I'm not going to pretend I know what I'm doing. I don't, entirely. But I'm learning, which is different from pretending, and I find I have more tolerance for not knowing things than I used to. Maybe because caring for someone sick teaches you that competence is a process, not a state you arrive at and stay in. Derek has not called again since that first voicemail. I have thought about reaching out and haven't yet. I'm not angry, or I am, sometimes, but it's not the sharpest thing I feel when I think about him. The sharpest thing is something more like grief for a version of family that we could have had and didn't. That's harder to know what to do with than anger. Paula and I had coffee last month in Columbus on neutral ground. It was awkward at first and then less so. She asked questions about the company that felt genuine. She's a lawyer and she has a practical mind, and I think she was also trying to understand something about my father that she hadn't seen up close. I told her about the site in Kettering. I told her about the site in Kettering. I told her about the Connie. I told her about the letter. She was quiet for a long time after that, and then she said, "He was a hard man to know." "Yeah," I said. "He was. But he knew you." I looked at my coffee cup. "Yeah," I said. "He did." We paid separately and walked to the parking garage together, and she hugged me before she got in her car. A real hug, not the funeral kind. And I stood there in the concrete stairwell for a second after she left and breathed. I think we'll be okay. Not the same as we could have been if things had been different. But okay, in the way that 2 people can be okay when they're both trying to be honest about what went wrong and neither one of them is pretending it didn't. I still wake up at 4:30 most mornings. My body hasn't learned yet that there's no one to check on. I make coffee and I sit at the kitchen table with the yellow legal pad where I keep my running list of things I need to learn. Questions for Connie, things Al has mentioned about the Kettering site. Some mornings I take out my father's letter and I read a paragraph or two. Not because I need to anymore. I have most of it memorized by now, but because there's something about seeing his handwriting. The cramped slant of the early pages. The loose 4th page. I always saw you. I think about that a lot. How strange it is to be seen by someone who never said so. How strange, and how worth it, and how much I would give to tell him I saw him too. The boots, the job sites, the phone calls at dinner. The man who cried through a wall when he thought no one was listening. The man who spent 30 years building something and thought the best way to say I love you was to give it to the person who would take care of it. I think I understand him now. I'm trying to be worthy of that. I'm trying every day. I think that's all he ever wanted from any of us. Not perfection, not gratitude, just the willingness to try. And I'm still here. I'm still in the room. I've thought a lot about what my father actually left me, not the company. Though that's real, and some days it still doesn't feel like mine. I mean what he left me before any of that. The years of watching him work, the way he never explained himself, never asked for credit, never waited for someone to tell him he was doing a good job. He just showed up. Every day. That was his whole philosophy. And he never called it a philosophy because he would have found that word embarrassing. I used to think the hard part of my life, the night shifts, the 4:30 mornings, the dinners standing up at the counter, was something that happened to me. A circumstance. An unlucky draw. But I've been sitting with this long enough now to see it differently. Every hard thing I did in those years made me into someone my father trusted was something he had spent 30 years building. Not because I suffered. Suffering alone doesn't make you anything. It was the choices inside the suffering to stay, to pay attention, to keep showing up even when no one was watching. That turned into something real. That's the part nobody talks about when they talk about people who have it together. They see the result and they miss the 10,000 mornings that made the result possible. Derek and Paula saw a company and a house. My father saw the person who had been building her capacity for responsibility quietly for years without knowing that's what she was doing. Those are two completely different things to look at. I'm not angry at my brother and sister. I want to be clear about that because it would be easy to read the story as a revenge story, and it isn't. What they didn't give my father in those years. The visits, the presence, the willingness to sit with something uncomfortable, that's already its own consequence. They have to live with knowing what they chose. I don't have to add anything to that. What I think about more is what my father understood about character. He believed. I know this now from the letter, from Connie, from the way he ran his company. That character isn't declared. It's demonstrated, over and over, in small moments that feel like they don't matter, until one day they add up to the whole of who you are. He tested that in himself for 69 years, and in the end, in the only way he knew how to say it, he told me he saw the same thing in me. I'm trying to be worthy of that every day. Not for him exactly. He's gone and he can't see it anymore. For myself. Because I've learned that integrity doesn't really work if it's performed for an audience. It only works when you do the right thing in the room where nobody's watching at 4:30 in the morning, when you're tired and nobody's going to thank you, and there's no letter waiting at the end. The letter was not the point. The point was every day before the letter. I think that's what he wanted me to understand. And I hope I finally do.